Banjo Kazooie, one of the most iconic 3D platformers out there, and standing right next to Super Mario 64 in that category on the Nintendo 64. Geniusly developed by Rareware in 1998, and going on to becoming their flagship series. But Banjo Kazooie had a long development cycle that started out as an entirely different game before featuring fourth wall breaking animals, and even then had numerous aspects cut from it during development, whether it be levels, items, or even a whole stop and swap system that they had in mind. And so today, we shall explore the complete history and beta unused content of Banjo Kazooie. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. Rareware was a long-standing development company that had been developing games for Nintendo consoles since the days of the NES. Whether it be games including the ever-popular Donkey Kong Country series, Battletoads, and so much more. As such, the British team had acquired a strong profit and started to invest in Silicon Graphics workstations in building three-dimensional graphics. But this wasn't to build polygonal 3D games, but rather make high-quality, highly detailed 3D models to take snapshots of in order to produce sprites to use in two-dimensional games in place of pixel art. As a result, this was used for the ever-popular classic Donkey Kong Country in 1994. With the success of that game and its sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2, utilizing that technology, they wish now to utilize it for an entirely original Super Nintendo game. Splitting the team into two, one was set to develop a third Donkey Kong Country game. The other was to make a new original game, led by Rare's co-founder, Tim Stamper. The team sought to take influence from Japanese RPGs of the era, while also taking influence from the many adventure games produced by LucasArts, as well as The Legend of Zelda. As such came an idea to not make a platformer this time, and more an RPG, one that had more of a fantasy magic element to it, while giving it that Rareware spice. Codenamed Project Dream, and eventually Dream Land of Giants, a title to emphasize the fairy tale-like game they wish to produce, as well as it being a dream project for the team, this being a magnum opus to say, and was to take the very rendering they used for Donkey Kong Country to a whole new level. Being built in an isometric angle with side-scrolling elements mixed in, the game was to feature a character by the name of Edson, a simple human red-haired boy with a sword, fitting of any RPG, accompanied together with his dog Dinger, an AI-controlled dog who would perform a number of tasks including finding hidden objects for Edson. However, with how versatile he was to the protagonist, an idea was formed to merge both Edson and Dinger as a duo character the character would control at once, an idea that would stick with them down the road. The game was of course to take place in a medieval fantasy world with giants all around, including giant dinosaurs that would crush Edson. As the game progressed in development, one major request both Tim Stamper and designer Greg Mayles made was to incorporate music that the player wouldn't get sick of, while also giving the characters their own theme songs. Simultaneously at the company, a musician by the name of Grant Kirkhope had been recently hired to create music for GoldenEye 64. The two had a curiosity on Kirkhope in their search for a musician, so one day they asked to listen to his work so far on GoldenEye. With his ability to make so many variations of a single theme, as he was doing with the Bond theme, they absolutely loved his work. So much so that it led to them hiring Kirkhope to be the composer on Project Dream. However, the project was getting ambitious. Too ambitious for the dying SNES. Stamper wanted voice acting, and the game overall was getting too large to hold all these rendered images made for this game too, and so came the decision to restart development on Nintendo's upcoming console, the Nintendo 64. Being that this was an RPG, the early N64 carts were obviously going to be too small, as they typically came in 4, 8, and 12 megabyte carts. Thus, they decided to utilize the 64 disk drive to use a full 64 megabyte magnetic disk for this dream project. With development restarting, the team started to move away from the idea of a fantasy setting and instead go into more of a pirate-based story, an inspiration taken from Donkey Kong Country 2 in fact, and would look less childish in comparison. Edson was to stay however as the protagonist, and this time he'd be caught up in the affairs of a band of ragtag pirates led by Captain Black Eye. What these pirates were doing was searching for a substance called the Floaty to let them craft a flying ship to conquer other lands. Dinger was also set to return, and this time was presented as a dog that Edson would rescue, while staying as the other half of the playable characters. But several new characters were also being introduced. A girlfriend for Edson named Madeline, a friendly pirate named Captain Cockeye, along with more minor characters including Bully the Troll, a character named Tip Top, and the actual main antagonist of the game, who surprisingly wasn't Captain Black Eye, but rather the giant that they were planning for the Super Nintendo version. The game was now to be in a full isometric 3D, and with no side-scrolling section. Edson played mainly the same, but this time, he could also shoot fireballs out of his hands. The areas, however, had to be entirely remade and redone. While the jungle area from the SNES days was carried over in a way, it was completely different this time, being more open. But as well, there was now a beach and a town too. The pirate themes were clear too, being that skeleton pirates were around, while the RPG mechanics, such as treasure chests, were also available. In creating the levels, designer Greg Miles was doing this in a rather revolutionary manner, whereby he would lay out a flat polygonal floor and stretch the polygons to create the landscape as needed. This was, however, too demanding of the Nintendo 64 and was giving it frame rate problems. Even so, the game was progressing well to the point of voice lines even being recorded, including for Captain Black Eye, whereby special dialogue was recorded for it to be presented at the upcoming Nintendo 1996 Shoshinkai event in December.
So it's true then. The Nintendo 64 treasure does exist after all. Ha 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 ha! It's mine, all mine!
But this never came to be, as the game's problems were starting to kick in once again. It was too ambitious. As quoted, it was big and sprawling, and too much for the Nintendo 64 to handle. While the team was feeling demotivated, they soon especially felt it. One of the other teams at Rare had been working on the game Conker's Quest, featuring an animal protagonist, which played very well and was more akin to Mario 64. It was looking far better than Dream ever dreamed of being. Seeing this, they decided that they need to change the game up to play more like Conker, getting rid of the RPG mechanics and making it a platformer. But Tim Stamper felt that it was time for Edson to be retired. Not only were they already feeling that he was rather out of place in the middle of a pirate setting, but they also wished for an animal protagonist like Conker. Several ideas were being drafted now for this new animal buddy, including a rabbit in a suit, which lasted for about 3 days of development. But soon came the idea of an anamorphic bear with a backpack to the style of a Japanese school bag to keep any and all of his items found in-game, while also carrying a sword, much as Edson had. Soon, he had a second revision where he had a shirt, and instead of a sword, he had these giant claws, perfect for a bear. Immediately, everyone fell in love with this bear, and so Edson had officially been fired. While the bear was brought in, like the rest of the game, he was to also have full voice acting. As a result, the head programmer of Dream, Chris Sutherland, was asked to voice this goofy-looking bear. Already he was set to voice Edson, so his main character role stayed. But the bear was a swap out for Edson, to the point of where the plot point of the dog Dinger being rescued was given for the bear to do, which even had Chris Sutherland doing the voice for that section.
A dog! I could hear a dog down there. I better go and see if he's all right.
Even with being more of a platformer, even with Edson being replaced with a bear, the technical problems were all still there with how large the project was. Feeling that even if they did keep working on this, it would take many more years before completing it. As such came the idea to downsize the game into something more reasonable and lead to a complete restart of the game featuring this new bear protagonist. Having missed Shoshinkai where they wanted to present Project Dream, it was now 1997 and development was starting once more. In fact, Grant Kirkhope, who had already made a whopping 107 tracks for Dream, had to basically start over again. As his tracks were more suited for a more serious RPG, here he had to now stylize his music for a more goofy animal platformer. Some tracks did stay in place as placeholders until they were eventually replaced. A few of those tracks are as followed. Realizing that this RPG had taken them to far more ambitious and bigger ideas, more than the N64 could handle, they had scaled back this project to something more reasonable. Being that Rare was originally put on the map for side-scrolling platformers in the first place, they had decided to make just that, a platformer. This one being called Kazoo. Difference this time, of course, being that it would be in full 3D, utilizing the same game engine for Project Dream, and thus more of a 2.5D platformer, featuring this bear who could better utilize his abilities to traverse levels, which now the bear was given a name, the name Banjo. Banjo himself was now given another redesign, with him now wearing that backpack fully on his back, yellow shorts, sneakers, and a cap, basically as 90s fashion as it got. This was also to be paired with a skateboard to have a sort of moveset, which the idea with his clothes were that if he got hit, he'd lose his hat, then his shoes, and finally going fully dead at 3 hits. Of course, even in the 90s this was a cliched look, and no one liked it. And so he was just left with his shorts and bag. Though calling it a 2.5D platformer is very loosely used here, as the levels, while they had a linear path with branching paths around, gave the ability for Banjo to move around in a full 360 degrees of direction to explore the level and pick up fruit, an equivalent to the bananas that Donkey Kong would collect in his own games, attack enemies, and use one of the many branching paths. In fact, the game was much more starting to resemble Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation, which had released just a year prior. Let alone just like that game, had Banjo traversing through a jungle level, a carryover from the Project Dream days, and the fruit collecting, which gave it an even bigger resemblance. Producer Tim Stamper, and now director Greg Mayles, wanted to include a major collectible in this game. Many platformers had a sort of collectible you can get, but 9 out of 10 times they were just for collecting, and not really useful in the long run. Mayle's desire was to have a collectible that would be useful, and so came the idea of these golden jigsaw puzzles called Jiggies, that you'd collect 5 in each level and utilize to open up new worlds via a picture you'd complete. Let alone the fruit collecting would also be used for redeeming Jiggies. Meanwhile, the game still would have more standard collectibles too, in the form of creatures called the Jinjo that Banjo would collect along the way. Originally, these guys would try to run away from Banjo and were intentionally gonna be hard to get, but later changed to be more stationary and even whistling to get Banjo's attention. And during the process, a large number of enemies were crafted for this game. Some crudely drawn, some actually built into the game. You got nasty squirrels, nasty plants, Mr. Mole, a kangaroo, 3 varieties of snails, which the base one did make it in. Same goes for these bull enemies called Bully, which would survive to the end, as well as a crab named Crabbo, which would also survive into the final game. There was also an electric eel, a hyena, a sleeping tiger, a leash dog named Ripper, a greedy pig, a fat bird that would stomp on Banjo, another bird enemy called Bombird who would fly live bombs to Banjo, and another bird enemy named Beaky who would steal Banjo's then cap, like a certain other platformer. There was also going to be the Stinky Kirky the skunk that would chase Banjo, one-shot him with his stench, along with a bear enemy called Jekyll and Hyde who transformed into his meaner self and also chased Banjo. And then there were some more mythical monsters too, including a Medusa-looking enemy that would freeze Banjo, a thief goblin that would steal Banjo's fruit, a 2-headed ogre, and a Cyclops. And then we got these that would be disguised as harmless objects, including Mr. Bush, Mr. Tree, Mr. Box, Mr. Signpost, and Mr. Strawberry, including with this one mushroom foe that was directly programmed in, called Mr. Helmet. As well, there was another strange one called Mr. Multiply that would create copies of itself to fight, along with a camouflage enemy called Chameleon Man to ambush Banjo. There was also another enemy called Bully, who was not a bull like the earlier ones, and this one would shake Banjo down for his fruits. Then there was one called Boomerang Thrower, and an enemy that would blow itself on Banjo called Bomb Master. Then there were two enemies involving boulders, Boulder Pusher, that would push a boulder to roll over and crush Banjo, and one called Boulder Rider, that would instead bowl a boulder to Banjo. Then there is Mr. Tentacle, who looks to be an octopus-like enemy that would sweep at Banjo, as well as an enemy with a massive club called Big Club, who was also dumb enough to even be lured to hit other enemies, along with a proposed boss fight too, who would grow larger and larger with each hit. The idea being that the more you feed him, the more he would grow and then explode. There's also a large robot too called Robokong, which could very well have been another boss fight. We also got a wizard who would transform Banjo into something else, which wasn't specified, whether it was one that would impede or help Banjo, a feature a prominent character later on would receive to Banjo's advantage. And in contrast, we got this more unique enemy, this witch enemy, that would turn Banjo into a frog, an enemy that would become much more prominent later in development. Now to tackle these enemies, Banjo's means of fighting were with his claws and jumps, while also being quite acrobatic with his ability to backflip. And taking inspiration from Donkey Kong Country's barrel attacks, Banjo was going to instead use sports balls to attack enemies, such as bowling balls across the ground, or a basketball, and even a water balloon. But even more flexible, whereby he could even use a soccer ball, a football that would go diagonally, a baseball glove to throw baseballs, or even a baseball bat to hit a baseball at an enemy. But the team, seeing how acrobatic Mario was, they wanted to make Banjo even more flexible. As such, they wanted Banjo to double jump. But this was rather ridiculous for a bear to do, so as such, they wanted to give him something that would instead assist him to do just that. Being a rather challenging concept, much brainstorming took place at Rare, but soon they came up with a desperate solution. A pair of wings would grow out of Banjo's backpack to let him do a second jump. With that, the idea grew for the backpack to also sport a pair of legs that would come out to let Banjo fast travel, but putting two and two together, the team realized that this simply would mean that another character actually would be living in Banjo's backpack, which would have it of course be a bird to fit that description. And so they decided to make this another character that would be accompanying Banjo, going back to the original idea of Project Dream of a dog that accompanied the protagonist. This bird was being designed to be a complete contrast to Banjo, being made red, given a rather sharp-tongued personality, while also being a girl, given the name of Tweeter. And with Tweeter added to the mix, Banjo's moveset expanded quite a bit. Of course, the double jump was given a name now, called the Tweeter Flap, later renamed as Feather Flap, that initially had a much bigger jump to it, with a long descent, eventually shortened by quite a bit, but as well as new moves, including Tweeter Nip, where she'd poke forward while Banjo faced the other way, to the Rat-a-tat Rap, and Banjo would be facing the same direction. There was also a rather vulgar one too, whereby she'd be shooting eggs from her rear, called Tweeter Shit. You can tell why this was changed with this E rating that they wanted. These, along with even full flying abilities and the beak barrage, where Tweeter would lunge forward to attack an enemy. Initially, it required Banjo and Tweeter to position themselves before the lunge could happen. Soon that delay was removed, and could be done nearly instantaneously and with a greater reach, with Tweeter extending her neck. And while Tweeter later in development would carry her sharp tongue, here she was a lot meaner, going as far as to even, and I quote, shits in backpack and sticks head out to laugh. And at this point, the models of Banjo and Tweeter were more or less finalized, but still lacked a lot of textures. Soon her wings were given feathered textures, while Banjo's shorts received some crease textures to go with it. Meanwhile, despite the game changing quite a bit from Project Dream, it still carried over much of the world and the story of the game. This including the main villain still being the sea pirate, Captain Blackeye, which would lead to a world of 10 islands that Banjo and Tweeter would traverse, including 32 levels. This would include the jungle, the beach, temple, water, mine, fantasy, swamp, a spooky landscape, a lava area, an ice world, and a desert level, including several locations to visit, including a factory, a big city, an Eskimo camp, a bear cave, and an oasis caravan. The jungle level, that has been seen a fair bit so far, had the objective of traversing from one end of the mountain to the other. Meanwhile, the beach level, which would be level 2, would have several branching paths leading to a more open-ended level, with tides changing the enemies in the area. Objectives including gathering 15 shells. There was also an idea involving scaling a giant tree, which was something seen in previous Donkey Kong Country games too. Meanwhile, the friendly pirate, Captain Cockeye, was still around and with a lookout available to visit. While it also can be argued that Banjo and Tweeter were the replacements of Edson and Dinger, it can also be argued that there was now also a new replacement for Edson's girlfriend Madeline, in the form of a female bear called Piccolo, even carrying Madeline's theme song still. One of the few tracks that Kirkhope had written for Dream that was kept in place temporarily. Have a listen. With 2 months in, and having made strong progress, it was now spring 1997. With Super Mario 64 out and about, Nintendo had Rareware take a good hard look at Super Mario 64 and how it played. Director Greg Mayles, looking at it closely, realized that they had been working with what looked rather old in appearance. 2D gameplay like Kazoo here just wasn't something that would interest gamers as much anymore in his view. It was like clearly our technology looked really old in comparison, and literally overnight we just thought that's gonna be the future of what 3D games are gonna look like. It was there that Greg Mayles and producer Tim Stamper decided that the game needed to be rebooted once more, and this time going 100% into the third dimension, gameplay wise. And so a week later, everything was scrapped. It was now early March 1997, and with a staff of just 10 people to start, they had in just 1 week of development shifted from the 2.5D iteration to a fully 3D one. In that time span, they had decided to change the game's title. Being already called Kazoo, it was kind of a meaningless title and referred to a musical instrument, much as Banjo's name did, as well as the other bear, Piccolo. Meanwhile, the bird Tweeter lacked a proper name. Tweeter was designed as a rather annoying bird with a sharp tongue and even defecating in Banjo's backpack. Meanwhile, the kazoo was an annoying sounding instrument, and thus the name and the bird were a match made in hell. So it was decided that the bird shall take the title's name, being renamed to Kazoo. Being that both Banjo and Kazoo were two halves of a character, the game now brought in Banjo's name too to share with Kazoo's name as Banjo Kazooie. And so the team modified the graphical engine, which was used to pull polygons from a base to build stages, to function more as a common polygonal stage building tool to build these fully 3D levels. And so being that this was the team's first true foray into working on a 3D platformer, they made a test map. This test map, like many others, were made with simple cubes. It was full of slopes at different heights. As a result, it was a good spot to test the game's mechanics in this new 3D engine, including the need of Kazoo to run up slopes while Banjo would slip down. But shortly after, they made another test level. Not one with simple cubes like this one, but one that actually looked and felt like a level, resembling that of a Mesoamerican temple, complete with gates, bridges, slopes, blocks, while also being several stories high. The level even featured gargoyle statues, which designer Ed Bryan based on the trolls from the very original version of Dream on the SNES. And so this made a perfect place to test and refine Banjo and Kazooie's moveset in the transition from the 2.5D build here. While the main moves were kept, the refinement process led to moves such as Feather Flap's Descent being severely shortened. Meanwhile, new moves such as a backflip were implemented, as well as a new Shock Spring special jump for Kazoo to utilize and jump, let alone testing flight in full 3D. While the camera was a major hurdle for them to figure out, with the characters constantly moving in 3D space, seeing the duo function so well in this one map gave the team the major confidence boost they needed. As lead engineer Paul McKayick would say, "We suddenly had impetus, there was direction, everyone was committed, and so came time to actually build the proper game." With new inspiration and confidence, the plans to make the world of Banjo and Kazoo were being made with the idea of being believable in a fantastical way, and so much brainstorming took place on as many locations as they could think of. This led to them coming up with ideas for at least 16 worlds. So shortly after, the first levels of the game were now in development, starting with Spiral Mountain. Initially, the idea of this mountain that would spiral upwards was that it was man-made with these bricks in place, but down the road was more of a natural formation. But as well, various enemies of stronger variety were placed here, including 2 of the bull enemies who were back from the Kazoo build, as well as a new gorilla enemy called Conga. As these were definitely enemies who were on the much tougher side, these eventually were moved to another level later in development. And so coming later to March 1997, the next level would be the beach level, their third take at making one, and this one quite resembling that of the 2.5D iteration, as that was even being made as a more open-ended level initially too. With this one being even more open-ended now, this was where these new pads were introduced that Kazoo can utilize to fly. The pads originally were entirely blue with a talon print, but soon changed to have red feathers, better resembling the action of flight for a red Kazoo. The level itself, while heavily resembling the concept art, had several changes. The starting platform initially being more an L shape, before straightened out. The sandcastle could be drained with a simple beak bomb, changed to having it plugged up through a character called Lakey the Bucket. The archway in the middle has a simple bridge connecting both sides, the bridge on a rock pier being made of wood before being changed to brick. And this whole back area initially required one to scale the mountain in a very dangerous feat to reach the pools at the top. Eventually, this was changed to simple stairs to avoid the constant threat of being shark food. As well, during the stage, the rope bridge was one that Banjo was able to walk up by himself, but was soon changed to require Kazoo to run up. Now the level's music track initially was a much slower and less energetic song here. But Grant Kirkhope eventually felt it just didn't feel right, and so he completely rewrote the song. Simultaneously, they were also making a level that would involve a giant shark, or as initially called, whale. This was a lush pond-like level in an enclosed mountain involving this organic beast called Clanker. But this level soon enough started seeing much changes whereby it started going completely mechanical, the cavern itself being now covered entirely in mechanical tubes and tiling vents, with all the lushness now gone. Not so much a pond anymore, but more cavern, and thus now renamed after the beast as Clanker's Cavern, which Clanker himself wasn't safe from being converted either, becoming a completely artificial shark. Roughly by mid-April, work was well underway on the jungle level. More or less was the team's fourth foray, introducing their default forested location as an early level. Starting out rather lush and green like any other jungle level, eventually the team decided that it was to stop being a jungle and more a mountain. Thus, much of its lush green textures became grayer and brown to reflect this. In fact, the theme for this level had a more jungle vibe to it initially, complete with animal sounds. But completely rewritten upon becoming a mountain. The level, of course, contained the bull enemy, albeit only one as opposed to the 4-on spiral mountain, and only one variety at that, with the other cut altogether. The gorilla now sat at the top of a tree, which interestingly enough, Conga here had a white shirt originally, but was swapped to a red one. Along with these, the level had another enemy, this being a masked enemy, which they hadn't even animated at first, as he was just popped into the level in a T-pose. The mask, in fact, had a resemblance more to a tribal mask, as the jungle area was at this point resembling more a tribal setting, which included a central shaman character for this level. One that would be a friendly character who would transform the duo using magic. This character may have even been inspired by the old wizard character that was planned for Kazoo, who would do the same kind of transformations for Banjo. Designer Ed Bryan, who already was the creator of the collectible characters the Jinjo, who was named by the team as that, as it was simply a joke towards the fact that its creator was a ginger, decided to create the shaman using the model of the Jinjo, with the addition of a skull mask and feathers for that tribal appearance. Initially, he had green skin, which only became greener to then a purple one before getting pink skin, soon to be given the proper or improper name of Mumbo Jumbo. As he was the central character to the level, and they were going for a mountain aesthetic now, the level was renamed to Mumbo's Mountain. This to the point of his hut even being changed to be a sturdy structure resembling his mask. Meanwhile, the other tribal enemies were changed to becoming the Grublin enemies, a means as to not confuse Mumbo Jumbo as an enemy due to their uncanny resemblance. And as development continued, another mountainous level was also being built called Bubble Gloop Swamp, taking place on a mountain that was full of swamp water, which the duo would have to scale between two levels of. An odd mishmash really, which may have led to the decision to change the mountain into a full-blown forested swamp. This change led to the mountains being changed to extra large trees all over the place as barriers. Even the wooden bridge was being changed to tree branches, as well as the evening sky becoming a pitch black night sky too, to set in that swamp mood further, fulfilling their mastery of building swamps that they were well known for since Donkey Kong Country. In many ways, both Mumbo's Mountain and Bubble Gloop Swamp had swap themes. And so now being late April, proper logos for the new Banjo Kazooie were being drafted, with them now making proper headway into development, having both Banjo and Kazooie's face in a very unsettling appearance in between their names. Also within the same time frame, in late April, a snow level was also being drafted called Freezy Z Park. A design that they made that very much stayed the course to the end, only major difference being that the snowman they drew was a lot more portly while also sporting arms. But at the same time, the water wasn't yet determined on how deep it should be or if it was even swimmable yet. As a result, underwater themes were made for it. One for the general area, and one for within the cave. Eventually it was determined that the water would hurt you, so therefore you shouldn't be swimming in it in the first place, and not even deep enough to play the underwater music. Let alone Grant Kirkhope had also made a slower, less energetic rendition of the Freezy Z Park theme, before giving that strong energy down the road. To finally something more in between. This was followed by a horror-based level in May 1997, which was modeled very closely to its concept art. Only change came about scaling the roof of the shed, which was originally going to be done with a stack of crates, but changed to a simple chalk jump pad. Meanwhile, Ed Bryan was once again reaching back to the Project Dream days, whereby much like the test level, he decided to design the ghost enemies after the trolls that appeared in the N64 version of the game, as well as even including a portrait of the original villain, Captain Blackeye, in the level as a little Easter egg. Now, while Banjo Kazooie and Mumbo Jumbo were brought into the fold as characters, another character from the days of Kazoo was being brought over too, a female bear by the name of Piccolo. Piccolo was already a character evolved from Edson's girlfriend Madeline, was about to see another major change. This time, Piccolo was being shrunk down to a more child-sized bear to better match Banjo as his little sister. Now, it should be noted that Piccolo was never designated as Banjo's girlfriend. This is a popular belief due to the fact that Nintendo Power falsely claimed this, but Greg Mayles has come out personally to state the truth in that she was never Banjo's girlfriend. But of course, what was needed most was an idea for a villain. With the move from Kazoo to Banjo-Kazoo, the story was altogether thrown out too, and starting over. As a result, Captain Blackeye and his pirates were not to be part of the story anymore. Initially, the team wanted to bring back the giant that was being penned as the major villain of Dream, with a hub world that would take place within a giant castle, whereby one would access each of these levels via a painting one would construct using collectible jiggies from each level. However, he was scrapped shortly after, and so taking inspiration from the witch Grotbags from the British television show Emu's All Life Pink Windmill Show, and the Wicked Witch of the West from The Wizard of Oz, the idea of a witch was being conceived. The team already had a witch enemy in the works during the 2.5D days of development who would turn Banjo into a frog. Taking that initial idea together with the wisecracking and bitter personality of the inspirations made the villain Gruntilda, which as such led that castle they wished to make for the giant to become more of a sprawling and varied witch's lair. Cauldrons all over, fitting of a witch's lair, to be used by Banjo to jump from one area to another with how large it was. The warp cauldron itself originally was designed to have a meaner look, complete with fangs, before giving its friendly appearance. And the whole premise with Gruntilda was that she'd kidnap Piccolo in order to use her to regain her youth, leading to Banjo, together with Kazoo, having to go and rescue her. In fact, plans even existed for an early cutscene of Gruntilda smoking a pipe and spying on Piccolo through her laptop, a scene that would never get into the game. But with the creation of these characters came the need to finally voice them. Initially, the game was set to also have voice acting, much as the previous iterations all had, and Banjo even already had a recorded voice from those days on Project Dream.
A dog! I could hear a dog down there. I better go and see if he's all right.
But ever since the inclusion of characters like Kazoo and Gruntilda, the banter of the game had gotten very heavy. Whether it be Kazoo's sharp tongue going off or Gruntilda's insults, it was too many lines to record and would only make development go on for even longer, despite already being in development for 2 years. So it was decided to drop voice acting and pursue more the styling of comedic grunts. Head programmer Chris Sutherland, who already had voiced Edson and later Banjo when introduced, made a simple but soon-to-be iconic grunt for Banjo. Kazoo, being both a girl and a bird, needed her own voice that was very distinct. Now, Kazoo wasn't based on any real bird, but rather a race they made up called the Breagles. Chris Sutherland, who also was to voice her, simply used the name of the race to scream Outside of Banjo, the other characters were being voiced by other Rareware staff with various grunts. Mumbo Jumbo, however, was a special case. Composer Grant Kirkhope, who was to voice him, had to give him a very distinct voice. Being that they wanted a rather stereotypical tribal-sounding voice for him, Kirkhope decided to record literally a bunch of Mumbo Jumbo and chopped it up to give it distinct lines. Lines like are made up from the line, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." Is based on Omi knackers, which Kirkhope himself would say when he visited a doctor to have his groin examined, which knackers is a British slang for testicles. This went as far as to make a special rain dance song for Mumbo Jumbo using these, but went unused. Have a listen. But aside from the voices, the game's music production by Kirkhope had been well underway since he rebooted with Kazoo, having this time taken much influence from Danny Elfman after listening to his score on Beetlejuice to make a mix of both comedic yet dark chords in order to produce the soundtrack of the game. In fact, was directly influenced from Elfman's score on 1989's Batman, but overall, the game had a very musical touch to it. Ever since the very beginning, in fact, when they had brought over Donkey Kong Country's composer David Wise, which was followed by Kirkhope for his ability to make remixes of tracks. While the bear was named Banjo, this was a pure coincidence, which influenced the team to just give everything a more musical touch. Banjo's sister Piccolo, Kazoo, and even the addition of musical notes one collects 100 of in every level. As well, they had plans for making an intro to the game where the game's cast would sing their roles. Of course, with the idea of voice lines removed, the cast was now down to just using their instruments instead. Once again, being that this was a game with a heavy musical influence since its inception, they had, through motion capture, captured various instruments being played to be used for the opening of the N64 version of Project Dream, in fact, which they wanted to use here again. However, in the end, they opted to just hand animate everyone's animations, except for Banjo's, as they really liked how the motion capture actor moved his hips as he played the banjo. As a result, the opening was being constructed with a simple background, but eventually changed to a more three-dimensional forest, complete with a waterfall. With the game coming so far, and having a solid structure after 2 years of work, along with the team growing to 15 members and working 80-hour work weeks, Rare was ready to show off Banjo-Kazooie at the June E3 1997. But one problem suddenly showed: trademark issues, with a few names in fact. In this case, Kazoo was trademarked already. A strange trademark, as it was simply the name of a musical instrument, but alas, simply wasn't usable. Instead of the poor bird getting another name change yet again, they simply added an I and an E at the end of Kazoo to make Kazooie, and thus avoided the trademark ordeal. As such, the title of the game was changed for one last time to Banjo Kazooie, with a hyphen even added between the names to further avoid the trademark issues. On top of that, Piccolo was also another trademark issue herself, possibly because of a certain other popular anime having a character of the same name. Being that she tooted a piccolo flute, it was simple to rename her as Tootie, and thus a crisis was averted, and the team could calmly trek forward to E3. Being May 1997, E3 was just a month away. Nintendo didn't want to reveal the game's current form prior to the event. The idea was for the game to be a sudden surprise, so they kept going forward with the old name Project Dream, as it was initially announced as just that, and to media outlets, its sudden reveal was finally happening. However, at the same time, Nintendo was showing the game behind closed doors to various retail managers. The way these managers would describe the game would be that it was very cartoony and a mixture of Super Mario 64 and Sega's Nights into Dream. That, along with a friendly young boy as the protagonist. An odd statement, since at this point, Edson would have been long removed from the project, but either they were this blind to mistake a bear for a human, or Nintendo asked them to keep the identity of the bear a secret, as all the public had seen up to this point was this one shot of Project Dream from way back. But with just days before the June E3 event, Nintendo revealed the name change from Project Dream to Banjo-Kazooie. Everyone hated it. Outlets such as IGN especially hating on the name change, describing it as everything from stupid, its lack of originality, and basically saying it's the worst name for a video game ever. In their defense, Nintendo used an excuse to say that the name simply was changed because Project Dream sounded too similar to Nights into Dream, a way to avoid the real reason for the game's several reboots, as it would spoil what the game was even about. And so came the fateful day, E3 1997 in Atlanta, Georgia. An E3 with a fair bit of major games being shown off across all platforms, including Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil 2, and Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation. While Nintendo was coming strong with games such as Zelda Ocarina of Time, Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, and of course, Banjo Kazooie. Rare had a lot to actually show, as their other teams were hard at work on GoldenEye and Conker's Quest. As such, a large number of Rare staff were there, proudly standing with their actual playable demo of Banjo Kazooie. The booth, which featured a large statue of Mumbo Jumbo, had the first 3 levels of the game in a playable state, featuring both Mumbo's Mountain, appropriately with the statue, Treasure Trove Cove, and Clanker's Cavern, all still in their early states. The reception was very positive, loving the visuals that gave it a Disney-esque animated appearance, while loving its rich world, animal characters, and music. IGN even walking back on all the complaining it did on the name change by absolutely loving everything about it. At the same time, the comparison to Super Mario 64 was quite heavy, some thinking of it as a blatant ripoff, but cuter, while some just in awe over this dual character in a Mario 64-like game with much slapstick humor all over. Overall, the skepticism was all but gone. This was all of a sudden one of the Nintendo 64's major heavy hitters. 64 Magazine even predicting that it will dominate the sales chart that Christmas, as it now had a release window of November 1997 planned. Or so the world still thought. While the E3 trade show continued, the team knew that they still had a lot of work to do in order to finish the game, and so the team from Rare met with Nintendo of America's chairman, Howard Lincoln, at E3 with a request to delay the game. He was furious, complaining about how they had committed $20 million to this campaign. However, he relented. Lincoln, of course, was counting on Banjo-Kazooie to be their big holiday game, but with that gone, they needed another game, which coincidentally, Rare was developing another game for that very holiday season, called Pro AM64, a sequel to their old NES racing series. As such, while at E3, the Rare staff met up with Nintendo's legendary producer, Shigeru Miyamoto, and showed him Pro AM64. Miyamoto was impressed, but suggested to Rare to include Diddy Kong within it. While they were against it at first, they came to love the idea, leading that game to eventually transform and become Diddy Kong Racing. But this went further now, to include characters from Rare's other games that they were working on, including Conker and even Banjo, which in an awkward twist would mean that Banjo would first appear in this game before his own game, and without Kazooie, though they made sure the manual would mention that this was before Banjo and Kazooie partnered up. Ironically, this was going to give Banjo a real line by Chris Sutherland, which his own game denied.
I'm Banjo.
But with that, the holiday season had been secured, and Banjo's actual own game could now have a good half year more of development time for a June 1998 release date. And so, with newfound confidence, development continued, and with having plenty of time now, the next round of levels were being drafted. These include a ship level called Rusty Bucket Bay, which had a helipad on the back of the ship, but as no plans for a helicopter were in mind, this was soon removed. On the other hand, this was a level being planned to have nothing but toxic water to make swimming that much tougher. But initially, the engine room was to have swimmable water, but was deflooded eventually and made the challenge in that room several times tougher. To which case, music was even produced for the swimmable section within the engine room that never got used. Have a listen. In addition, a special vent was being made for the level, whereby if one got close to it, it would open up and shoot steam at Banjo, damaging him. But with how hazard-filled this level already was, might be why this was never used. But simultaneously, 2 other levels were being drafted, one being Mount Fire Eyes, a lava level, iconic to any 3D platformer, featuring volcanoes, a coliseum, and even having Banjo swim down to the middle of the lava when a camel's spit cools the lava down, and as well a mine level featuring many mine tracks, a waterfall, and even a game of whack-a-mole. And more levels were being constructed based on those ideas they brainstormed. A desert-based level called Gobby's Valley, a carnival level based on Gruntilda called Fairground, another forest level called Fungus Forest. There's also a debated idea on if a level called Mayhem Temple was one that they were indeed designing then too, which composer Grant Kirkhope claims they were, while director Greg Mayles has denied it. Soon by mid-August, the final major level, Click Clock Woods, started production. A level that would go through a literal year by visiting the Four Seasons via a hub world, and this level was one level they especially were planning out carefully with how the concept art is practically one-to-one with what they soon made. Slight variations did come, however, in the form of this on vacation sign that was to be used in the winter version of the level on Mumbo's hut. But this was soon removed for an NPC simply telling Banjo that Mumbo had gone on vacation. Along with these, 2 songs were made for the house that slowly gets built in that level. While in the spring section it is unfinished, and winter it's boarded up, you could go inside it during the summer and fall, but it wasn't made as a separate map. So these themes that Kirkhope made for the summer and fall house were never used. Have a listen. But as development moved forward, the game started to have its existing levels refined. In September, Spiral Mountain had its final design planned, and this time included Gruntilda's ugly mug on the entrance to her lair. In October, Clanker's Cavern finally went more mechanical, and we got our shark modified into an android. And soon by November, it was Space World 1997, whereby to a Japanese audience, the game was finally being presented for the first time. This time they had 5 playable levels, with of course Mumbo's Mountain looking a lot like the final games, except that old beta enemies still being around. Treasure Trove Cove, Mad Monster Mansion, Bubble Gloop Swamp, and now its full force swampiness, and the desert level, Gobi's Valley, which 64 magazine mentioned how its panel had women dressed in banjo costumes with shirts on. None of which was presented in that issue, but otherwise loved the game's various environments down to their more realistic effects. While Zelda and Pokemon were both the talk of the town at the show, the game still stood its ground for its quality. And so, with the year rounding out, 1998 was fast approaching, with 6 more months of development still ahead, and a lot to do. Plans that may not pan out as they would have hoped for. With 1998 now here, the final concepts for maps were being drawn up, specifically for Gruntilda's board game that one would play before the final battle. But a new plan was also being made whereby, after the final battle, when Banjo and Kazooie defeat Gruntilda, she has to shoot up magic in a last-ditch effort and turn the duo into a frog, a possible callback to her old regular witch enemy self from the Kazoo days, who could turn Banjo into a frog too. This would then lead to an additional mode to follow, where one would play as the freed Tootie to collect these special coins that would reverse the frog spell on Banjo to bring about the game's true ending. And even some ideas were coming together for a multiplayer mode too, as per expectations for rarer games now, with how wildly successful and popular they were, especially within GoldenEye 64. But an obvious truth was coming to light for the team. They were making too many maps. So many in fact, that several simply couldn't be completed. As a result, the multiplayer mode, Lava Level, The Mine, Fair World, Fungus Forest, and Mayhem Temple, if this was actually real depending on which one of these two is correct, had to be dropped, but not scrapped altogether, but to be used in future projects. Which this also led to the potential end of Tootie's adventure, thus leading the magic spell to just miss Banjo and Kazooie, freeing us all from ever playing as her. And so now with what was left over, the team was to refine and work these to have a true and complete game by June 1998. One day at Rare, while developing Banjo Kazooie was going strong, a sudden discovery was made about the Nintendo 64. If one turns off a game, the system's RAM retains the data for at least 30 seconds. And so genius struck the team at Rare of utilizing this feature with not just Banjo Kazooie, but 6 of their future games. The idea was to program Banjo Kazooie to have these items within it. Later, upon the release of these future rarer games, upon a certain trigger being activated, the system would be turned off, and within 30 seconds, you would swap the cartridge with Banjo Kazooie. This would lead the RAM data left from that game to be read by Banjo Kazooie, and thus writing into the game new data to get these very items, to which then one would swap out the Banjo Kazooie cart to the original cart to transfer said items there to be used to their fullest potential. This method was to be called Stop and Swap. Thus what the team did was program 6 mysterious eggs and an ice key into the game, all hidden away and functionless in locations not accessible unless one conducts the Stop and Swap method. The ice key was specifically being planned for use with Donkey Kong 64, which was in concurrent development by the team, where when you activate a trigger in Donkey Kong 64, possibly this fridge with Banjo and Kazooie's face on it, you then turn off the console, pop in Banjo Kazooie in 30 seconds, turn on the console to then automatically have access to that area with the ice key. And so once collected, you once again turn off the console, swap back to Donkey Kong 64 to have the ice key in your inventory. Then utilizing that fridge once more, you would then go into what would be an absolute mayhem in crystal caves in order to receive this golden banana. Other features were also planned too, including finding this golden statue of Donkey Kong in Creepy Castle, looking eerily like the Banjo statues from this game. And then there were plans to utilize this feature for the sequel they were planning, which they even made text in the game telling you of how these items would in some ways be used with the sequel, leading to both games benefiting and unlocking desirable new features. And so with that discovery, Rareware went as far as to write up a patent for this feature. And this whole process was something they weren't telling Nintendo about just yet. However, they had still programmed a way to get to those very areas holding these stop and swap items without the actual need of stop and swapping. And this was with these very lengthy passwords one could enter in the sandcastle at Treasure Trove Cove, possibly as a means to access and test the areas themselves, as simply collecting them does nothing on their own, and thus needed that new data from the sequel to activate whatever these were. And so quietly, the feature was put in, for now. And so with a few months left to release, polish was being given for the game's remaining stages. Banjo's house, which originally sported a picture of Donkey Kong, possibly since they were developing the game on the side, was scrapped to simply a picture of Tootie, let alone his entire house just receiving a large texture makeover, Grunty's lair changing the music door colors from red to simply a wood texture and adding the required note number directly on the door itself as opposed to above. That along with adding stage names to the actual entrances. The Mumbo-like enemies in Mumbo's Mountain finally being swapped out for the new Grublin enemies, who were green originally before becoming purple. Trees that were 2D billboards became full 3D. This bridge going through much evolution, from logs to cut wood to a plank bridge. Mumbo's hut becoming darker and adding a green floor, along with feathers to its exterior, let alone the panel you stand on to transform, becoming a full-on button. A flag object that likely was to be used in this race at Freezeezy Park was removed. Mad Monster Mansion's portraits were reworked, adding in the portrait of Gruntilda in place of this glass pane over the fireplace. Starting pads, which were simple colored images of the duo, were now full metallic stands of their face, and even a quick save to Gruntilda's lair was removed, requiring one to actually backtrack to the starting pad. The supporting character, Bottles, had his glasses changed from black to red. The empty honeycomb's interface was reworked to be at a better angle. The hourglass was also recolored. Meanwhile, the remaining voice work was being conducted, with staff performing various grunts and sounds. Composer Grant Kirkhope himself even voicing a flower pot you do a side quest for within Mad Monster Mansion, who recorded the simple line of saying, "Thank you." Nintendo, however, was skeptical on that take, as it sounded very similar to Kirk Hope simply saying F you, which Kirk Hope debated with Nintendo of accusing him of that, stating, "Do you really think I'm gonna say that in a kid's game?" After about a good 50 takes of recording, Nintendo was satisfied enough. And for the last time, Banjo Kazooie would appear at E3 in late May 1998. While it was just a month before its release, they were still showing a slightly earlier build with a few differences, like Mumbo's Hut still not featuring that button, and the bridge at Mumbo's Mountain still being of that older design, let alone the booth still using that old logo that featured both their heads in the middle, possibly just cause it was more eye-catching here. And with the final month of June 1998 on hand, marketing of the game was in full force already, with Rare pumping out screenshot after screenshot, and commercials as wacky as the game coming out. Even a special 10-minute promo tape was put out by Nintendo to further promote the game with the subscribers of Nintendo Power, narrated by none other than famed American comedian John Lovitz, with his unique voice for this rather unique game. And so after a long 3 years of development, Banjo Kazooie released in North America on June 29, 1998, in Europe on July 17, and December 6 in Japan. The game was nothing short of an absolute success, topping charts across all regions, at the very top of the UK chart, entering the top 10 in Japan, and selling 1.8 million copies in the US. Eventually coming to a combined worldwide sale of a whopping 3 million copies, making it one of the best-selling games on the Nintendo 64. And critically, it stood very tall too, with scores well into the 90s. Magazines such as EGM noting the great depth the game's levels would offer, IGN loving the usage of 2 characters and their usage to complete tasks, referring to it as addictive. This followed by N64 magazine and how they loved how well it was designed around Banjo and Kazooie's skill sets, but publications such as All Game noting its similarities to Super Mario 64, even calling it a clone, but yet with many new features that keep it quite fresh, which GameSpot even mentioned how a fan of Super Mario 64 would definitely enjoy this, and the high praises for this game would go on, being nominated for several Game of the Year awards, and even winning many of them, such as the Best Graphics and Music of 1998. The legacy of Banjo Kazooie cannot be understated, popularizing a new 3D platformer subgenre called the Collectathon, which influenced many other games over time, including Rare's other game in co-development, Donkey Kong 64, which was already taking the scrap level Fungus Forest into its own game, whereby the influence of Banjo Kazooie had changed it from a straight platformer into the largest collectathon to date, whether for better or for worse. Indie games such as A Hat in Time even saw some influence, and it even can be argued that Super Mario Odyssey took that very influence of collecting, with how the focus of the series shifted there, coming full circle with how at one point Banjo Kazooie became what it was cause of Super Mario 64, let alone staff that had left Rare over the years formed what they touted was a Banjo Kazooie spiritual successor called Ukulele, following the subgenre of the Collectathon. Despite it all though, their hopes for the stop and swap system that they had programmed in would be put to a halt upon Nintendo disallowing it near the end of Donkey Kong 64's development, citing how it could damage a cartridge between the swap, as well as console revisions changing how long the RAM would hold the data. But eventually, years later, the game would see remaster re-released on the Xbox 360, whereby it not just updated the textures, models, and lighting, but as well even completed the long-dead stop and swap system. But as soon as the game's development finished, a sequel was already in the works by the team that would follow and expand upon the game they had made, bringing back many of its cut ideas, whether it be levels or even its multiplayer mode. A game by the name of Banjo-Tooie. And thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe button for I'll plan to be back with more Banjo Kazooie and other games gaming history and cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on which cut feature you would have wanted to have stayed in. So everyone, thank you for watching.